Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Faith Brynel Talks Law podcast. I'm Faith Brynel, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. This is a podcast where we explore the legal careers, real journeys, and pathways shaping the future of the legal profession. Today's episode, I'm joined by Mark Blois, founding partner of the education practice at Browne Jacobson. Browne Jacobson is a market-leading law firm in the school sector and a 7-time winner of Legal Advisor to Education Institutions at the Education Investor Awards. Mark is ranked Band 1 in Chambers and is recognized in the Legal 500 Hall of Fame for his outstanding contribution to the education sector. With over 25 years of experience, he has not only shaped legal practice, but also around academy trusts, charities, and national organizations. Mark, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing very well, and thank you very much for inviting me, Faith.
Excellent, Mark. I'm very excited to get stuck into your journey, and I'm sure the listeners will really enjoy hearing about your story as well. So really, my first question is, what initially drew you to education law, and what has kept you committed to the sector over the years?
So it's slightly accidental rather than being drawn directly to it. So when I was a trainee solicitor, and shortly thereafter, there was a new line of litigation being brought against local authorities, which we now know as failure to educate.
Mhm.
So that was essentially normally adults looking back at their time at school, having been diagnosed with some form of special educational needs. For example, dyslexia was very, very common, and finding or suggesting and alleging that there were shortcomings in how they've been supported while they were at school, and effectively suing for negligence, to put it in those basic terms. And there was a lot of that work, or a lot of those claims being brought, that came into the firm through existing clients. And the individual partner who I worked for essentially asked me to get on with it, which I did my best to do. And I found that really, really interesting. I'm definitely not a litigator. I found that out very quickly. That's definitely not me. But I did thoroughly enjoy working with education professionals. I found them extremely interesting people. I enjoyed learning about their world and their day-to-day lives. I was also very aware that the litigation wouldn't last indefinitely, probably wouldn't last that long, in fact. So I tried to then broaden out into other areas of education, and advise schools directly. And I suppose, as they say, the rest is history. So
Amazing, Mark. Thank you very much for sharing your inspirational journey. As you said, you stumbled across it accidentally, but clearly it's something that's kept you engaged and interested over the years. And I think that's really important, to be able to pivot and to adapt to adapt to life.
yeah,
And indeed, the whole mantra of this podcast is to pivot and don't panic,
okay,
because your journey begins now. And that's what I really encourage my listeners to adopt. So I'm glad that
yeah,
you
great. I like
also
that a
spoke
lot.
about the impact.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's
I'm
great.
glad. But yes, so we pivot and we don't panic here at Faith Bernard Talks Law. And I think that just reflects being resilient. And just a question really on that, in terms of pivot and don't panic. How important do you think it is to be resilient as either a law student or either as an aspiring lawyer?
I think it's an essential quality. Both trying to get into the profession, and then probably if you're in the profession, um, yes, it's clearly very, very competitive, and a lot of interest in doing that sort of work, or working in different capacities within the legal profession. I think the
Mhm.
resilience is key to be able to, well, probably two things at least: to put the hours in when you've got the opportunities, to put the time and the effort in, to give of your best when you do have the opportunity to share that with organisations or people. But I think also resilience to pick yourself up and go again, or pivot, to use your expression, when you get knockbacks, because there will inevitably be
Mm.
knockbacks. And holding on to that belief that is what you want to do, that you're capable of doing it, and continuing to try and build the case why you should be doing it. I think that does
Mhm.
require resilience, definitely.
Excellent. Yeah, 100% agree with that. I think resilience is the bedrock to success, and you have to be able to continue to push yourself beyond the fray, even when you've got your
Mm,
challenges. And we've all had our challenges and continue to sometimes be challenged by things, but we must not be deterred by them. We
agree.
must just push forward. So thank you very much, Mark, for sharing such an important perspective that I know that the listeners will really benefit from. But just segueing now into education law. Do you
Mm.
think that education law offers something unique compared to other legal specialisms in terms of purpose and long-term impact?
Well, I am a little bit biased on that question, so I declare that up front. Yes, yes, I do. I'm obviously very much with that view, having spent the last 30 years doing it. Um, I think there is. I think you need to be a certain sort of person to
Hmm.
want to do education law work and to thrive in it. There's obviously
Hmm.
choices to be made even within the sphere of education law because you could work for schools and colleges and at universities as provided, or you could work for children and their parents and their carers. You could work for employees through the
Hmm.
unions. And so there's lots of different angles. The angle that I've always followed and Browne Jacobson follows is that we want to be supporting the providers. So we work for the schools, the trusts, the universities, helping them with all of the various legal issues that come up. I think the team and myself are motivated by, we're incredibly aware that we're not
Hmm.
frontline. We're there are many, many, many people actually in the education profession who are making much more significant differences. But if we're able to um, take away or at least provide confidence and understanding and
Mm.
reassurance around some of the many issues, legal issues that they have to deal with almost as part of their day job nowadays, then we think that's a valuable contribution. And because our client base is so very big across the country,
Hmm.
when we aggregate all the pieces of work that we do every year, we hope that there is a positive impact, and then we derive motivation and purpose day to day from that sort of a dynamic. So yes, I think that's not to say, of course, there aren't many other areas of the law and the legal profession that also offer that. Um, but that's my interpretation, having been an education lawyer.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your perspective, which is really valued because I think when we're thinking about the infrastructure at university, when you're in undergraduate law, when you're studying postgraduate law, education law isn't always an area that law students hear about from
Mm,
the outset. It's always about criminal or family. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's good to be aware of different types of law, such as education law,
mm,
because it allows you really to connect with a sense of purpose, a sense of community building, and I think it's something that a lot of aspiring lawyers are actively searching for in their careers, an
mm,
opportunity to contribute to society as a whole, to
mm,
really engage with people from different walks of life, and holding differing lived experiences. And I think that's really
mm,
important. So clearly, what
yeah,
you've demonstrated, Mark, through your anecdotal experiences and through what you've shared, is the opportunity to make a meaningful impact
yes.
in a range of different communities as a whole. But I'm really interested now in some of the challenges. What
Mm,
would you say are some of the key legal challenges currently facing schools, but also
mm.
educational institutions from a legal perspective?
Where to start? Yes, there are so many,
Hmm.
unfortunately. I think the simplest way of unpacking that question faces what tends to happen,
Hmm.
particularly in the schools and trust sector, perhaps slightly less so in the universities, but in the schools and trust sector, what we tend to see is that society's biggest issues play out very dramatically,
Yeah.
very, very coherently, and sometimes incoherently through education. So a lot of the patterns that we see more widely, the things we read about in the news, the things that we talk about with our friends and our colleagues and our families, that they are things that become actually very, very important and actually have a legal perspective within schools.
Hmm.
Um, so I give you some examples of that. One of the things that is absolutely a key challenge facing schools and trusts is special educational needs and
Hmm.
provision around that. It's a very challenged part of the system, always have been, of course,
Hmm.
because there's never enough money, never will be enough
Hmm.
money. And it's a very legalistic, regulated area as well in terms of
Yeah.
obligations that schools have.
Mhm.
So that's one example I think that of a legal challenge. Another I think would be things like complaints. Parents are, some would say,
Mm.
not unreasonably, very demanding of schools and are very keen to draw attention where they believe
Yeah.
they think they see shortcomings. One of the complications and a good example of society's biggest issues playing out is that AI
Mm.
is now hugely exacerbating that as a problem for the school sector because it's just enabling parents to create very, very long, convoluted documents as part of their complaints process. It's enabling them to turn
Mhm.
them around extremely quickly. And then I think probably
Right.
we also see probably less of this sort of what you might call pastoral education law, but obviously schools and trusts themselves are having to look at organisational issues, how they structure
Mm.
themselves from a governance point of view, how they structure
Mhm.
themselves in terms of their human resources, and there's legal perspectives and angles on all of those. So I think that all of those challenges, and there are many more, make it a very,
Mm.
very interesting and very fast moving area of the law as well.
Definitely. Well, again, Mark, thank you very much for really kind of sharing an insight into a few of the challenges and issues that education law is facing and having to deal with constantly around special educational needs and disabilities. You mentioned looking at governance issues
Mm.
and looking at artificial intelligence (AI), and actually that was one of my next kind of I'd say questions on AI is how has the growing use of technology and AI created additional challenges for education
Mm.
providers?
Yeah, yeah. I mentioned obviously the one with
Mhm.
complaints. Plagiarism is another one. Obviously, and that's not reliant entirely on AI, but AI does a sort of
Yeah.
exacerbate it. I think the problem with AI is it's still relatively new in terms of its actual mainstream impact. We're all sort of beginning
Mhm.
to properly understand its capacity. There are lots of opportunities, I think, that come for schools around,
Yeah.
particularly around data, understanding the data that's so important to the outcomes they're trying to achieve. But I think,
Mhm.
as I mentioned, there are lots and lots of challenges that come with it, and I think at this moment we're slightly in what I might call it the wild west of AI in schools because
Yeah.
it's I think certainly in terms of the issues that we see at Browne Jacobson and those we
Mhm.
try and help our clients with, it is more of a hindrance and an enabler. And I think in due
Mhm.
course, hopefully, it will become more of an enabler than a hindrance. But I don't think we're there at the moment. No.
Well, thank you, Mark, again, just for briefly and clearly speaking about that and some of the challenges facing the education law sector, especially having a look at artificial intelligence (AI). I think if looking at the balance or trying to strike a balance between that accountability and the limited
Mm,
resources, which is quite interesting, as you said, looking at some of the pitfalls and struggles, really,
mm,
especially because it demonstrates how the role of lawyers also is evolving beyond simply providing legal advice, but is
mm,
becoming into
mm,
those strategic partners. So I think that's quite interesting to notice that shift as well in your role, but also in the shift in the types of cases that you'll be asked to kind of
mm,
face and to try and find
mm.
a form of solution in those cases. Looking at the governance experience you've had extensive governance experience
Yeah.
and any trust, and you did kind of briefly speak about that. But how has this, briefly shaped your approach to legal advice?
Mm. It's been invaluable.
Hmm.
It wasn't the driver or the motivator to get involved in governance. I did that because, as I said earlier, I was just fascinated by the
Yeah.
sector. I was curious to learn more. Um,
Hmm.
and I would also say it's any education lawyer will tell you it's quite a common scenario where you do hopefully a good piece of work for a client and conclude it, and they turn around and say, just one more thing. Would you join the governing body or join the trust board? So that happened to me a very, very long time ago. And I got involved in what was initially primary school governance. That then uh, became an academy. That then became a multi academy trust and is now 27 school
Wow.
multi academy trust. So I chaired that for 10 years. Now,
Mm.
for me, I got a lot of personal satisfaction and I learned a huge amount as an individual from carrying out
Mhm.
that role. But from the point of view of the work I do and how it shaped my legal advice, it enabled and enables me even now to have a really good insight into what it is to be on the other side of the table, to be the client.
Yes.
Obviously, I had to work with lawyers in my capacity as a chair, not
Mm,
with Browne Jacobson, I might add. That would have been a slightly dubious conflict. But that insight into how the real issues land with real people,
mm,
um, and
yes.
making sure you never lose sight of that when you're advising in your day-to-day job, that's been absolutely invaluable. And I think it's where a young lawyer does have that opportunity, not necessarily in education, but it could be in a different sector,
Mhm,
to really get cheek by jowl with people who are doing the job that they are, as
mhm.
lawyers, advising on and supporting. I think it can be incredibly helpful and enhance the qualities that they're able to offer as a lawyer to those clients.
Well, amazing, Mark. I think, well, first of all, thank you again, really, just for speaking about that, because having a look at the lens of governance roles, it must give you a diverging perspective from lawyers who
Mm,
solely advise externally. And that practical insight is incredibly valuable
it is,
because
yeah,
what it does,
yeah.
it bridges the gap between that legal theory and that tangible impact, and which is something that many students don't always get exposure to because when
Mm,
you're studying, you have that
exactly,
theoretical
yeah.
lens on, but you have to step
Mm.
out of that theoretical and get that practical work experience,
Yeah,
whether
you
it
do,
be
and
through mini
I think
pupilages. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. I'd just give you an
yeah,
example
go ahead.
of the difference between,
Yeah,
I think,
yeah, please do.
understanding an area of law, as you put it, sort of theoretically, and understanding it
Mm,
in practice. If we take education law, it's quite rare for us to be advising
mm,
a client on a single area of education law, because so many of the issues that arise actually draw in a whole range of different areas of education law. So you might have a
mm,
situation involving a pupil and a parent that involves, it might involve safeguarding, could involve special educational needs, could involve disability, could involve exclusions and behaviour, could involve
mhm,
parental complaints, probably would involve data protection. So
mm,
you learn very quickly when you're actually in the hot seat of a governance role, working alongside senior executives who are running these organizations, that they're
mhm.
not able to come to you and say, "Hi, Mark, I've got an exclusion question, or I've got a safeguarding question." They just have a problem, and they need a solution.
Yeah,
So understanding the complexity of actual the real world in terms of what you're advising on, that can be
yeah.
very, very valuable.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think, it's going on to that point where you have to have that tangible impact, that tangible
Yeah.
exposure through mini pupilages, vacation schemes, and even other types of work experience where, as you
Mm,
said, you might be shadowing in a school or having a look at governance boards, or, you might be an intern or something like that. But it just
mm,
gives you, it gives you that diversity of thought. And you're able to, as you said, Mark, to pose those questions that you might not have been able to ask or even discover hitherto
yeah,
before you
yeah.
qualify,
Mm,
because yes, there's a benefit in having that kind of that theoretical study. Yes, you need it as you need it as a hard skill, but in terms of building your soft skills of communication, adaptability, pivoting in
mm,
times of challenge, you've got to be
mm.
in those arenas and in those
Yeah,
spaces. And for me, as
agreed.
an aspiring barrister myself, this conversation has really given me personally an insight into education law, some of the nuances, some of the challenges, and just some of the ways of navigating through that as a young person.
Mm,
But my
mm,
final question to you,
mm,
Mark, is looking to the future for aspiring lawyers now, what
mm,
advice would you give them if they're interested in education law or in the public sector as a whole?
mm. So I think if they have that nascent interest or well-developed interest, um, then I think that's something to really, really hang on to. What I would say is, I think sometimes young lawyers or aspiring lawyers who are interested in the education sector, or the public sector more generally, sometimes I think can be incredibly talented, incredibly purposeful, but struggle a little bit when they get into the real world law firm environment.
Hmm.
Because obviously that you don't have to work in a law firm. You could work in a local authority or a charity. But if you're working in a law firm like Browne Jacobson, yeah, while it's a very purposeful business, it is a business, and there are processes, and there is a day job. Now, what I think is really key for people to understand is that you need to choose and pursue an area of the law
Hmm.
where the pressures and the demands of the day-to-day process will be more
Yeah.
than adequately set off by your enjoyment, your curiosity, your sense of purpose in relation to the areas you're advising on, and obviously the end user and what they're responsible for. And I think so really
Mhm.
not, I suppose my advice would be, don't underestimate the actual real world of a law firm and all of, all of the
Mm.
commerciality that has to come with that. But also don't have your lights put out by that. They can coexist. It might take a little while to settle down and find your feet and feel that you're doing both adequately or even better than adequately. So, um, but I think sometimes it can be difficult initially for people to say, okay, well, I want to have a purpose, I want to have a positive impact, but I've also got to work in a law firm where I'm going to have it held
Mm.
to account around targets and things like that. But I think it
Yeah.
does take time, but it is possible. So that would be, I suppose, my word of reassurance. Don't if you feel that way and you feel that burning passion to do a role that is going to contribute, not change the
Mhm.
world in its own right, but contribute to good outcomes, then don't be dissuaded just because you need to be going through a process day to day that can sometimes be
Yes.
very challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing, Mark. That's such important advice, and it's such a great point to end on today, especially around building simultaneously that technical legal knowledge and a genuine understanding. As you said, that word of reassurance, don't be
Yeah.
put
Yeah.
off. As you said, it is going to be a new shift for them coming out of the academic environment, stepping into the world of
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
It's good to
Absolutely.
be adequately prepared. And to everyone who is listening and keeps coming back to this podcast, you are in the right place, because we will have guests, and we will have more guests like Mark who will candidly share their stories, their journeys, their advice for you, to pick up on that. But yes, Mark, thank you so much for joining me today. Your insights into education law, into leadership, into your journey, and really understanding how to pivot have been so incredibly valuable. And now, and now to everyone who's listening, this episode has highlighted how law can shape the entire sectors and create real impact beyond the courtroom. So if you've enjoyed this episode, which I really hope you have, do continue to follow on your podcast platform of choice on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. A shout out to the 82 countries who are listening. Welcome back. Do follow Faith Brynel Talks Law on social media for more conversations like this. Until next time, remember, pivot and don't panic. Your journey can begin now. Bye, everyone.